Hello, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, where it depends where you are. Thank you so much for joining us for the third session and the last one of the first International Colloquium Mare Nostrum. My name is Thais Rocha. I am a postdoc at the University of São Paulo and a research fellow at Oxford. And I work with household archaeology and domestic space in New Kingdom, Egypt. I'll chair today's session, and before anything else, I would like to remind to everyone watching us to please write down your name and your institution in the chat so you can receive the certificate after the event today. Also, if you haven't registered yet, please do so in the following link. My colleague is putting this on, and we will make sure we read all the questions at the end. So please, during the presentations, feel free to write down your questions, to make comments. And at the end, I will organize and put all together so we can read the questions for the speakers. So this colloquium about gender and intersectionality in antiquity is the result of the publication by the scientific journal Mare Nostrum, about the same topic. This special volume was launched in September this year, and this journal is an initiative of the Lynn, the multidisciplinary research group focused on the ancient Roman Empire and the ancient Mediterranean, and it's based at the University of São Paulo. This research group is coordinated by Professor Norberto Guarinello, who we hope is watching us today. We are also very pleased that this publication is the result of the efforts of the Messalinas, the research group about gender and sexuality in the ancient world, which is coordinated by Dr. Sara Azevedo, who is currently a lecturer at the University of São Paulo. I would like to thank both Professor Guarinello and Dr. Azevedo for their support this evening and for the support we had during the preparation of the publication and this event. I would like to thank Fabrizio Sparvoli as well, our master's student who made this publication possible in a very difficult year for us all. Gabriel Bernardo, who is a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo, is the magician of the evening. He's in charge of this virtual room. Thank you so much for setting this up for us. And we also would like to thank this, to take this opportunity, to celebrate this publication together with the next volume of Mare Nostrum, which is out today. This new issue is focused on ancient religion and will be presented later today by the PhD candidate, Ana Paula Scarpa, and this presentation will be in Portuguese. But before we move to this next volume, I would like to introduce our speakers of the day or the evening. We are very pleased to get together three Orientalists from three different parts of the world, working with gender in a very interesting way, bringing together different disciplines. And this session is based on the papers they publish in our volume. And we believe this is a great opportunity to encourage everyone who didn't have the chance to read. So please do so. The link of the publication will be on screen shortly. So this panel certainly celebrates a lot of different things for us in Brazil. It mirrors the recent development of gender studies in antiquity by Brazilian scholars. And in special, I dare to say, and I'm very biased here, we celebrate the development of the studies about ancient Near East and ancient Egypt, which is, these are topics very much in progress in the country nowadays. So now I will introduce our first speaker of the evening, Dr. Stephanie Lynn Budin, who is an ancient historian who focuses on gender, religion, sexuality, and iconography in ancient Greece and the Near East. Her published works include Women in Antiquity, Real Women Across the Ancient World by Routledge 2016, Artemis from 2015, Images of Woman and Child from the Bronze Age, published by Cambridge University Press 2011, The Myth of Sacred Prostitution in Antiquity, also by Cambridge University Press 2008, and The Origin of Aphrodite, CDL Press, 2003, as well as numerous articles on ancient religion, gender, and iconography. She has lectured throughout North America, Europe, the Near East, and Japan. She's currently the editor of Near Eastern Archaeology, a publication of the American Societies of Overseas Research, ASOR. And she's also the slave of two cute bunnies, Shadow and Poppins, who may be bonking her feet during this talk. So I welcome Dr. Stephanie Budin, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Thais, so much for having me and for inviting me to write an introduction to the volume that turned into a ridiculously overlong paper. Hi, everyone. I am taking it as a given or as a hope that you've already read the paper. I'm not going to be going over the contents of the paper in this talk. What I'm going to be doing here is giving background as to what led me to write the paper that I did for the Mare Nostrum publication. So this is more a talk about theory, and as you are going to discover, it is a remarkably non-theoretical paper on theory. And if any of you out there know me, you know that I'm not very theoretical to begin with, so this should come as no surprise. So the paper I wrote was Sex and Gender and Sex, and that is exactly what the paper was on. Guillermo, could you give me the first PowerPoint slide there? I'm assuming they're there. Yay, okay. Yep, so fairly simple there. That is the title of the paper. Okay. I wrote, no, that's good, that's good. I wrote this paper because I found that something that was really bugging me in the real or mundane world was really starting to infest and infect my research and my work world as well. And basically that problem was third wave feminism. The ideas most commonly associated with the theorist Judith Butler, but spread out amongst several other third wave feminists such as Monique Wittig or Moira Gattens. And especially this idea that gender, okay, is performance, and that binary sex doesn't actually exist, and that biological sex, and that's usually presented as biological in quotation marks, is really just socially prescribed gender after all. So we've eliminated the distinction between sex and gender, and we've determined that the scientific, the physical, the biological doesn't actually exist. It's all just gender, and it's strictly non-binary. Now, the reason that this was bothering me, next slide, please. Thank you. And this is one of these standard quotations that one will come across dealing with the annihilation of sex in preference of the idea of gender. Now, one of the reasons this was bothering me so much in the real world as opposed to the academic was that I kept coming across people who were being bullied, literally bullied into accepting its dictates, even when they didn't believe them or when they flat out knew they were not accurate. So let me give you a very simple example. I'm a member of a group that is called the Society for Creative Anachronism. You may have heard of it. I was at an arts event where a very kind, very well-educated man known as Master Philip, he was the master of the dance, was attempting to teach Renaissance choreographies to a group of people. Now, for any of you who have ever studied period dance, you know these are typically danced as couples, men starting to the left, women starting to the right. Except Master Philip was not allowed to use any of this terminology. It had been severely explained to him that there was no such thing as binary sex or gender, so there could be no man and no woman. And so this poor fellow who had read and memorized numerous period texts referring to men who started on the left and women who started on the right had to go through all sorts of verbal contortions to explain who went where when, all while apologizing for the Renaissance text that referred to these people as male and female, insisting for his own part that he couldn't possibly understand why they did that. He was literally terrified. Obviously, there was a problem. I really started engaging in this issue myself academically when I was writing my book on chorotrophic iconography. Next slide, please. This was not supposed to be a book. This was supposed to be a 10 or so page article on how chorotrophic imagery started appearing on the island of Crete through Cypriot influence. I had just finished my book on the non-existence of sacred prostitution, and I needed something to stop me from looking up the word prostitution in every single index of every book I opened, including cookbooks. I was still really obsessed, and for the record, I did come across a number of really good recipes for vegan puttanesca that way, but the point was I needed something to disengage my brain, so I started writing this work on chorotrophic iconography. It emerged into a book. And in the process, I became extremely interested in the gender implications, mainly because every single chorotrophos I found was female, and you see before you, hopefully, a slight display of these. Basically, what I discovered is that females take care of children. And this was not a matter of biology. I wasn't looking at images of pregnancy or childbirth. I was looking at adults holding infants and children. And with exceptionally few, exclusively 18th dynasty Egyptian examples, every single one of them was female. And this was not biology, again, although I really should point out that every example of a pregnant or parturient individual was also female. Next slide, please. Thank you. This was engendered. This was not biological. No dad ever took the 4 a.m. feeding or took charge of the kids while mom was in the bathtub. Childcare was gendered female. Childbearing was sexed female, full stop. And I discovered that this was a fact that the third wave feminists I was looking at did not want to deal with. As a matter of fact, with Butler's notion that sex is really just gender, avidly embraced notion, I realized that no one ever really even explained how gender wound up seeming binary, and this could lead to seemingly binary sex. If there are no females or males, where did feminine and masculine come from? And why specifically did the former always wind up with childcare duties? So, few more research projects made me deal with the issue even more. I was really interested in this notion of maternity contra third wave notions. And at the time I got invited to give a keynote lecture at the History and Equality Conference that was hosted by the Norwegian School in Athens, a conference that was about gender and theory in ancient studies, a bit like this one. I gave a paper on how the reality of maternity overthrew or at least defied third wave notions of binary sex. Basically, you get impregnators or impregnatees. Now, obviously, you can choose to be neither. But the point is, your body is set up in advance to be one or the other. And if you don't believe me, consider this fact. Male rape victims do not worry about pregnancy anywhere nearly as much as female victims. It's gendered, it's biological, it's sex. So I ended my talk with a consideration of how this biological reality of female sex maternity led to binary female engendering, especially how women were expected to provide maternal services such as comforting even in academia. And it was particularly, I think, touching or poignant that while I was giving my talk, I gave the example of female academics who get much harsher reviews and evaluations from students who are dinging them because, well, she's not caring enough, she's not comforting enough, in a way that none of the male academics never had to deal with. And it just so happened that while I was going over this and giving a few case examples, a woman in the audience started crying, and she came up to me afterwards to apologize for crying during my talk, which I suppose was better than flat out laughing during my talk. But the point is, what she explained to me is that this had just happened to her. She had gotten excoriated in a letter from a graduate student after his male dissertation director was very harsh on him during his oral exams, and she couldn't understand why she was being yelled at but not the male director. And suddenly everything fell into place, and she really came to understand that notion that the personal actually is political. It's not you, it's the system. This is how reality is working. It's really engendered, and the engendering comes from the ultimate biology. All right. So when it came time to publish the conference proceedings, I got a lot of pushback from the assistant editors. The paper was great. They really loved it. They were happy to publish it. But would I just revise my thesis so that I agreed with Judith Butler? Well, no, I couldn't do that. That was actually the antithesis of the point that I was making. Okay, that's absolutely fine. And then a year later, I heard back from them again asking, would I please revise my paper so that I agree with Judith Butler? And I told them no again. And a year after that, I got the exact same request, because what they desperately wanted to do was have this united front saying that all the academes totally realize and accept and promote the idea that sex doesn't exist, that gender is fluid, and didn't want to publish anything that disagreed, not based on the data or anything else, just the theory. The book is supposed to be coming out probably in the next couple of weeks because it was scheduled for 2020. And literally to this moment, I have no idea if they ever included my paper or not. Just because they had such a problem, not with the data, but with whether or not I'm going to accept these notions. So in a way, it's academic bullying. Now, another thing that then brought this topic into focus for me. So these are all these cases where I'm running across an apparent problem in the study of gender in antiquity. The editors at Routledge Publishers asked me to write a book on gender in the ancient Near East, which now, thank you COVID, is hilariously behind schedule. It seems that an article that I wrote a while back in 2016 on gender and fertility in the ancient Near East got a very good reception, so they wanted to expand that out into a book. So I wrote up a book proposal looking at issues of masculinity and femininity in the ancient Near East, and I sent it off. And one of the reviewers of the proposal wrote back absolutely horrified, wondering how on earth I could impose my modern Western notions of binary sex onto the ancient world that way. My editor freaked out and asked me how to address this to the acquisitions board. So I explained, for example, in Mesopotamia, men's names, next slide please, are marked by a cuneiform sign, the dish sign, for those of you who are familiar with this. That is the wedge-shaped end of evolution of a sign that was originally the drawing of a man's penis. So basically, Dick, George, Mr. George. And by contrast, women's names, next slide please, were marked by the munus sign, which marked women's names, and that was the schematic for originally a drawing of, well, basically a vulva. You can kind of see it there. How much more binary can you get when we have male-female names that are marked by male and female genitalia? And if you're looking for a certain kind of constant socialized gender, allow me to point out, some of you already know this, that the drawings that led to cuneiform all rotated 90 degrees. You can look at the munus symbol there. The point used to be downward. The only one that stayed fully erect throughout time was the dish sign. And if that doesn't say something about masculinity, I don't know what's going to. So she was comfortable with that, and the proposal did get accepted. All of this was happening against a backdrop of article after article after article that I was reading, desperate to insist upon the accuracy of Butler's claims that sex is gender, thus socially constructed and non-binary. I kept reading about third and fourth genders, so there aren't two, but there could be four, but not about W or Z chromosomes. I did a book review of an edited volume on gender and prehistory, where there were an awful lot of authors who seemed to feel compelled to insist that gender was fluid, even when it had nothing to do with their topic. So you'd be reading this article about rock carvings in Northern Africa, and shoved in there somewhere was a statement that gender is fluid. So it was like there was some contractual obligation, or maybe the Norwegians were hassling them, I don't know, but it was really interfering with the scholarship, and it did keep coming across that, oh yeah, you have to say this, it's required. While this is happening in academia, I'm seeing more of this in the mundane world, as was the case with poor old Philip. People, for example, were really starting to take their pronouns amazingly seriously. I don't know if that's happening in the rest of the world. It is definitely speaking in the English-speaking world. Apparently, people have the idea that by manipulating their pronouns, they can change their sex, along with all the gender-based baggage that went with it. There are a couple of problems with this. First and foremost, the English language does not have gender. Either of the so-called sexual type, it's not la table and le voyage. I'm sorry, I was told I should probably give Portuguese examples, but I can't pronounce Portuguese. And while I could make you laugh, that wasn't my intent here. Anyway, we don't have that kind of gender in English. We also don't have the sentient versus non-sentient kind of gender that you see in Sumerian and Japanese, the thing that distinguishes Iru from Aru, for example. So we have he and she as pronouns, but those are sex, not gender. Second, you can't actually change your sex by changing your pronoun. My niece tried this by changing her pronouns to he, him, his on Facebook, and she still had breasts, and she still wound up needing a hysterectomy. I should point out she never wound up signing up for the draft, as is required for all U.S. male citizens when they hit age 18, because I think deep down she knew that she was still female as well. So it doesn't work. It doesn't achieve any goals. So what winds up happening instead is that people are socially pressured to lie, to agree that this obviously female person with breasts and hips is he, and that this obviously male person with the Adam's apple and the facial stubble is she, and that that single individual there is they. This is what George Orwell in his 1984 dystopian novel called doublespeak. When you say it is true, something you know flat out is not true because you're forced to. So then all these trends started crashing together. Not only did we agree with Butler that biological sex was a social construct and that apparently babies came from cabbage patches, but that this notion of binary sex was a modern Western construction, some aspect of colonial oppression that did not exist in antiquity or the non-Western indigenous world. So, for example, the Mesopotamians had no concept of binary sex, although they did have third gender and occasionally fourth. The Bronze Age Cypriots believed that their children were gender neutral and only ascribed a gender at adolescence or adulthood. Various non-modern, non-Western populations worldwide proved that social constructs of binary gender had nothing to do with biology, as so-called biological females were identified as male and vice versa. Even many baseline genetics proved that binary sex was wrong. I mean, there's so many variations on XX, XY. Haven't you read Anne Fausto Sterling, for goodness sake? And actually, in the end, it doesn't matter if you've read Anne Fausto Sterling or even Judith Butler. The necessary quotations and factoids have simply been passed down author to author. I believe it was Laurent Lele who was the first to refer to the sworn virgins of Albania in her 2005 publication, The Gendered Sea. An example of gender not mapping onto sex, in which I talk about extensively in the paper. I do know that I have come across the gender-bending, sex-defying Virginiche several times since then, none of which refer back to Antonia Young or René Crémeau, the anthropologists who actually studied this category of individuals, but to Tlele, who was writing about the Bronze Age Mediterranean at the time, not Albania. As a matter of fact, one of the follow-up authors paid so little attention to the specifics of any of this, she actually referred to the sword virgins of northern Alabama. And if any of you are from the United States, you're probably finding this really amusing right about now. So what happened is that it became necessary only to have a sound bite, so to speak, to back assurances of the correctness of third wave propositions. No genetic sexual dimorphism, that's fine. You just mention Fausto Sterling. You don't actually have to know what she said. She just has to be in a citation somewhere. No fixed gender. You can just mention Albania or, necessary, Alabama. The ancients were free form in sex and gender. Just see anything published pretty much in the 21st century predicated upon these previously mentioned authors. If you actually try to mention sex and gender and the intractability of these facts in certain aspects of ancient life, next slide please, such as maternity or the sexing of pelvic bones, or the fact that there is an awful lot of stuff that men can do that women cannot in, say, the Hebrew Bible, you might be asked to rewrite your paper, or you might be ignored, or you might be called a bully yourself. So anyway, I suppose one might ask, where's the harm? Appreciating that fluidity of gender, which I happen to believe, by the way, has allowed modern historians and archaeologists to reconsider the ancient data and to see things in new ways. So for example, moms might still be women and vice versa, but we do have to consider that ancient constructs of fertility frequently had more to do with males than females. Next slide, please. There's a good visual for that, if you will. And that females, next slide, please, can be violent and erotic and not consistently the Earth Mother fertility goddesses we claim in print. One should always look at the old stuff in new ways. This is important. Likewise, where's the harm in my niece now being a they, them, their on Facebook? Well, part of the harm is that we are willfully denying reality, and we are really being bullies about it. When a grown, buxom woman sticks her bare breast into your face while angrily demanding to be called they, them, their, and referring to herself, not her breast, that would at least make some sense. And this actually happened to a friend of mine in a BDSM dungeon, and no, this is not abuse he paid for. This just happened to him. She is basically demanding that the really obvious reality of her sex be ignored and forcing my friend to succumb to social pressure to say what he knows is not true. Or, well, double speak. It is a lack of scientific realism, a willingness to believe that what I want to be true is, rather than what all the evidence indicates is true. It's like saying there's no climate change because I don't want there to be. It's like claiming that a pandemic is not happening because it's economically inconvenient or because I don't want to wear a mask. And speaking of Western colonization, we are now inflicting our notions of non-binary and non-biological sex onto the ancient world. And they have no ability to contradict us or even to tell us that we sound insane. And again, because this is really important to me, in a modern context, we cannot fight gender injustice if we do not recognize that women and men exist and that sex is an innate part of their physical, biological bodies. If there are no men or women, think about it. There can be no such thing as hetero or homosexuality. Slide, please. Why then should we fight for gay marriage? If there are no men or women, then there can be no transitioning between them. Why fight for trans rights? If there are no biological women or men, merely people who identify as female or male, why is it that those who choose to identify as male keep getting higher pay than those who choose to identify as female? If I switch from female to male, can I get a raise? If I switch from female to male, can I still ask for maternity leave? And what happens when I do? Why doesn't identifying as male protect me from pregnancy? Why doesn't identifying as female get my husband multiple orgasms? Now, in all fairness, I don't necessarily think that's an aspect of social justice, but then I'm not a guy, so maybe the men have more to add on that topic. I don't know. So in the end, I wrote this paper that, once again, was supposed to be a 2,000-word introduction. Sorry again, Thais, to highlight the uncritically accepted factoids promulgated in ancient studies to bolster the claims of the third wave and to make sure that the baseline information was actually expressed somewhere, and so that we can really appreciate how problematic these data can be. As I said at the end of the paper, we need to clear our heads both in modern society and in our approaches to the ancient world. Next slide, please. Men on the left, women on the right. These are our primary sources. You got to deal with it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your very provocative talk. I'm sure we will have questions. I already saw one in the chat. If you just arrived, I just want to remind you that please put your name and your institution in the chat so you can receive the certificate later on. And also questions for later. We'll have the 3 papers and then we'll have the discussion afterwards. So thank you again, Stephanie. Looking forward for the discussion. So I'm very happy to introduce now the second speaker of this evening, Anita Fattori. Anita is a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo and Paris 1 Sorbonne, under the supervision of Professor Marcelo Rede and also Professor Cécile Michel. Anita received her MPhil in Cultural Studies at EASH, also University of São Paulo, and she conducted her research with the RScan research group. Her work is sponsored by FAPESP at the moment, and she's currently member of the LAOP, the research group about the ancient Near East, and the Messalinas, both at the University of São Paulo. So welcome, Anita, and thank you for joining us tonight. Anita, I think you are muted. Sorry. You have to unmute the microphone. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much. Great.
Hello, everyone. I'm just waiting for the slides. Should we start? Okay, thank you, Gabriel. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Sara Azevedo, Fabrício Sparvoli, and Thais Rocha for the organizing committee for the space to debate our research. It's a pleasure to be here along Dr. Stefan Budin and Guilherme Borges Pires. I'd like to thank you also my advisor, Professor Marcelo Rede, and Professor Cécile Michel, for all their support. The São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, for my scholarship, and last but not least, all the research from LAOP and from Messalinas. I'm Anita Fattori, and today I present the main arguments of my paper, published in the last issue of the Brazilian journal Mare Nostrum. Next slide, please. The article is written in Portuguese with an abstract in English. It's possible, the QR code does not appear, but we can access in the Mare Nostrum link. Please find there all the bibliographic reference that I quote in this communication. This paper is part of my doctoral research conducted in a joint program at University of São Paulo and Paris 1 Sorbonne. In my PhD, I examined 80 letters from and to Assyrian women. My goal is to understand in what context multiple agents of Assyrian women appeared. For this presentation specifically, I will look at 7 letters by women to understand to constitute their place in society in comparison with the held by men. This is a work in progress, and I will appreciate any suggestions and feedback. Next, please. Gender studies has recently been incorporated into Assyriology, and the results of its use have outlined new approaches to understand of the societies of the ancient Near East. I discuss here the performance of Assyrian women in the context of the interregional commerce of the second millennium BCE, to explore some dimensions of their social role. This paper is organized as this. Firstly, I contextualize gender studies in the field of sociology. Secondly, I analyze the contextual framework of my corpus, and then I offer an interpretation based on the perspective of gender regimes. Next. The insertion of feminist criticism in social history has encouraged the emergence of women's history from the 60s onwards. Gender studies appeared in the 70s and 80s as a subfield of women's history. Starting from the 80s, scholars began to write about the presence of women in the cuneiform documentation to bring them into the spotlight of the ancient Mesopotamian history. However, only in the 20s, gender studies sit on the Assyriologist's dinner table. Up to this point, the history of women was limited to transliteration, translation, and publication of documents in which women appeared. Indeed, analysis of the role performed by these women were postponed for the years to come. Studies on women on the cuneiform documentation remain for the long based on both the philological dimension of analysis and a double androcentrism, partially explained by the sheer quantities of writing source. We know for the fact that in Mesopotamia, a great deal of documents was produced by men and for men. But the unresearched history of the field also tells us that Assyriology was written by men scholars, and today most of the academic production is still male-dominated. It comes as no surprise that the majority of women portrayed in those studies are goddesses and elite women, such as queens and priestesses, which were granted a prominent position in society. But apart from the circumstances and contingents on the history of this documentation, the writing of Mesopotamian women in general concentrated on uses and conditions of female body, especially relating to prostitution and motherhood. The subject that to come to grips with today is decidedly unusual, a documentation that allows us to know the lives of common women. Next slide, please. Here, I am referring specifically to the performance of Assyrian women in the interregional trade networks of the second millennium BCE, the so-called Old Assyrian period. The merchants of Assur, in what is now north of Iraq, were actively engaged in an extensive commercial route. They left the city of Assur and traveled almost 1,000 kilometers in donkey caravans to settle down in Kanesh, Anatolia, today Kultep, Turkey. In the port of trade of Kanesh, they negotiated large quantities of tin and textile in exchange for silver and gold. The Assyrian women based in Assur produced part of those textiles that feed the family business abroad. The commercial networks depend on efficient communication between Assur and Kanesh. In the Assyrian period, this communication was established by the exchange of cuneiform letters. Consequently, merchants in Kanesh sent to and received from letters from their families and business partners in Assur. The largest quantities of missives dug out support their importance in the dynamic web of interactions between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Around 30 and 50% of documents found in Assyrian merchants' archives in Kanesh were letters. Among them, we find letters addressed to and sent by women of merchants' family, mothers, daughters, wives, sisters. Today I will talk about those women. Next slide, please. For a long time, research on Assyrian women did not question the place they occupied in society. By doing so, scholars reinforce the lack of female agency. As time goes on, new investigations start to highlight the agents of these women. However, these studies end up to an either or neither situation, protagonism or exceptionalism. In the former case, women are presented as supporting actors, enter the scene when male protagonists are absent, that is, men concedes to women a space of action. As stated by Van Hoff, and then I quote, various merchant wives, in absence of their husbands, came to function as heads of the household, acquiring quite a number of responsibilities, end of quote. Here, women's agents conceived a secondary one, mediated by their husband. In the later, women also was portrayed as, and then I quote, almost as active as men in matters of social life, end of quote. Since the preparation of Mesopotamian women outside the domestic domain was considered exceptional. Next slide, please. Based on the considerations of Lett and Sebilot-Cruchet, I employed the concepts of gender regime to explore the social fabric of this context. Strictly speaking, and then I quote, a gender regime can be defined as a particular and unique assemblage of relations of sex within a specific documentary, relational, and historical context, end of quote. These regimes appear within established limits, and then I quote, in a comparative space occupied by gender differences, end of quote. Rhetoric strategies are frequently devised by Assyrian women and materialized in the clay tablets of cuneiform letters. In my analysis of those letters, I highlight the space of activity of these women that simultaneously converge to and diverge from their families and business partners. These movements are expressions of gender difference. It is worth keeping in mind that gender difference are not the only explanation of an entire social phenomenon in this context. Gender difference are part of this society and crossed by other aspects, as social status and age, for example. Assyrian women run the household, include the management of people and activity, the negotiation and acquisition of products necessary for the family's survival, as well as the production of textile to be sent to Kanesh. They also received silver and gold, which reveals their direct participation in trade networks, as we see below. Next slide, please. In several letters, men question women about shipping and quality of textiles. Likewise, women question men about the silver equivalent to the textile production, as we can see in the letters from Lamash to her husband Pushuken and from Tarankub to her husband Inaya, as is on the slide, and I quote, say to Pushuken, does speak Lamash, for what reason do you always write to me? The textiles you used to send to me are not good. Say to Inaya, does speak Tarankub, I cannot send you in every occasion textiles which are heavy. Say to Pushuken, does speak Lamash, as for the textiles which Ashur Malik brought to you early, why don't you send silver to me? End of the quote. Next. In another letter, Lamassi requests to her husband wool, as is on the slide, and I quote, say to Pushuken, does speak Lamash, when you send me the purse, put within wool, because wool is expensive in the city of Ashur. End of quote. Lamassi is not asking for wool because there is none in Ashur. It should be stressed that she is asking for wool at a time that the cost of raw material seems to be rising in Ashur. Keeping this in mind, we can consider the possibility that Lamash took into account the wool price fluctuation. She decided to send the request, despite the high cost of transportation of wool from Anatolia. Lamash engages in business activities through a complex decision-making process. As part of commercial networks, women were responsible for many activities, such as textile manufacture, ensure the arrival of the cargo of textiles in Anatolia, bookkeeping and storage of merchandise, maintenance of archives, in case of legal disputes, representation of their husband before the authorities in Ashur. At the same time, Assyrian merchants established in Kanesh carry out activities such as maintenance of archives and bookkeeping. However, we do not have evidence showing husbands represent women in legal disputes. Participation of Assyrian women in family firms allowed them to articulate themselves with new spaces, conducting transactions of their own interests. They accumulated personal spoil that went beyond the doral or jewelry. Women could invest the silver they received in exchange for textile manufacture, acting as creditors or small quantities of silver, copper, or wool. Additionally, they could transact business with other merchants, as we can see in the letter from Ahaha to her brother, Ashur-Mutapil, as is on the slide, and I quote, "To Ashur-Mutapil say, thus speak Ahaha, I invested 3.5 minas of silver in the commercial society of Buzur Ashur." Next slide, please. The last aspect that I briefly bring up is the religious one. Assyrian women engaged with the religious domain in a particular way. In several letters, they request more silver to be dedicated and deposited as a votive offering. They demand for their husband to return from Kanesh in order to send their daughters to priesthood. In time of health problems, women charge their husbands and brothers of weakness in faith. I examine now two excerpts, one from a letter by Lamash to her husband Pusuken about their daughter Ahaha. The other fragment is from a letter by Tarishmatun and her daughter Belatun to her brother Pushken, as is on the slide, and I quote. To Pushken say, thus speak Lamash, the girl Ahaha grew up. Leave and come here to the city of Ashur. Place her in the front of the god Ashur. To Pushken says, thus speak Tarishmatun and Belatun. Now, because of the silver of the votive offering to the god, Belatun is sick. End of quote. In this respect, in the letters sent by their brothers and husband, at least those that have reached us, the reference to religious domain do not alike. As noted by Michel, assigning a daughter to priesthood was not just a matter of gratitude towards the god. It also implied the confirmation of a privileged social position. In other words, it's a way to legitimate the hierarchy of these families. In addition, some rituals, such as the cult of dead or the sending of daughters to priesthood, seem to be primarily a male social task. Moreover, the way women dealt with religious issues in the letters lead us to think they did not acting according to faith principles alone. The way women wrote for their husband can be interpreted in this context as a way to reinforce their social bonds. Women claim the moral obligation of their partners by asking them to return to Ashur. Next slide. Thank you. Perhaps we, as moderns, have been writing ancient women out of history in our facile efforts to include them. We do this in particular by emphasizing the absence of women in history, focusing superficially on exceptional image of women, and simplify women into types that reflect our own expectations and values. And this approach obscures the complexity of ancient Near East womanhood. However, by affording the ancient records its own voice, the individuality and complexity of women's lives and facets of womanhood emerge to replace, rather than reiterate, the conventional grand narrative on women, and to remind us that the ancient Near East was not as much of a man world as we have made it out to be. Cancel 2020. Through these letters, we can see a feminine, multi-layered agency with the simple idea of absence of husband would not be able to produce. we can observe a variety of possibilities arrangements of roles, the wild performance and female mobility within a dynamic environment, as well as the reconfiguration of gender regimes with the participation of family organizations in trade networks. The excerpts of the letter sent by Lamash, Tarankub, and Haha, Tarishimatum, and Belatum show us the social interaction of those women with their partners and allow us to see expressions of gender difference. The evidence considered suggests how gender regimes were articulated, how these women positioned themselves in the web dynamic of social relations, and how they were perceived in the context in which they lived, not only in the scenario of confluence of activities with men's, but also in discursive space to seem exclusive to them. All things considered, I tentatively suggest a way forward on the applicability of the notions of gender regimes in sociology. Question these documents from the perspective of gender theories is an important approach to understand the social fabric. By revisiting previous interpretations models and rethink the process of formation of knowledge, we can offer a more complex picture of social relation in ancient Near East. Next. Thank you for your attention, and I leave here my email if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. It was a fascinating presentation. I would like to remind everyone who's just arrived, please make sure you put your name on the chat so you can receive the certificate. Also, there are a couple of important links. We put in the chat the link for the registration of the event, also for the papers. Just a reminder that the talks today are based on the papers published by the journal Mare Nostrum. And I just want to say very quickly, I'm very pleased that we have colleagues and friends from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate, we know some of you are in crazy time zones now, so it could be either very late in the evening or very, very early in the morning. So we appreciate the effort to join us. And now I'm going to introduce the last speaker of today. Guilherme Borges Pires, who graduated in history at Faculdade de Ciências Sociais e Humanas, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, in 2013. He has a MA in Egyptology by the same institution, where he presented the dissertation Perceiving the Sacred, the Sacralization of Aquatic and Terrestrial Spaces in Ancient Egypt, and that was in 2015. Currently, he is a PhD candidate, and his research focuses on the conceptions surrounding the creator and creation in the New Kingdom's religions hymns. From September 2016 to December 2017, he proceeded his doctoral research and attended courses and seminars at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, the Center Vladimir Golishnev, sorry if I mispronounced it. And more recently, he has been living and conducting research in London. Since February 2020, he holds a volunteer position at the EES, the Egyptian Exploration Society, within the project Scanning the Covers and Contents of Historical Egypt Travel Magazines. He's a researcher at CHAM, Center for the Humanities, at the University Nova of Lisboa, and also Universidade dos Açores, and he's a member of the Association for Students of Egyptology, the ASC, and of the International Association of Egyptologists. He participated in several international scientific meetings, both as a lecturer and as an organizer, and he's the author of some publications. I'm very pleased to welcome Guilherme tonight and make a special acknowledgement because it's late now in London and we appreciate you stay up to join us. So thank you. And
thank you. Hey everyone. Thank you very much, Thais, and all the organizers, not only for allowing my paper to be published, in the journal Mare Nostrum, but also for inviting me to talk to you tonight. As Thais were saying, it is 10 o'clock now in London. I must say it's first for me. I've never given a paper or a lecture so late in the evening. So please bear with me with any inconsistencies in my speech, hopefully not so many. I'll try and share my presentation. Hopefully that will work. Are you seeing it now? Excuse me, is it working?
Yes, we can see a bit of a crazy screen. Yeah, there you go. Awesome.
Now you can see everything, right? Okay. So once again, thank you very much for the organizers and also for everyone in the audience. I appreciate we're all in different time zones. And it's been definitely a pleasure to publish with Mare Nostrum and to be with you tonight. For me tonight, sorry, anyway. So as Thais were saying before, I'm currently writing my PhD, and that's on the concepts of creator and creation in the New Kingdom religious hymns. And so this is basically to contextualize my research and where this paper came from. So I'm basically, I'm centering my research in three main axes, so to say, and I like to think about them as entangled and intertwined. So I have three fundamental questions. So who creates? Basically the identity of the creator. What is created? So basically the achievements, the things that are created, the beings, the entities that are created by the demiurge, by the creator in his enterprise, and how is it created? So the processes, mechanisms, devices used by this creator to achieve the world as we know it. And I like to think of these three questions as all related to each other. And what I'm talking to you tonight about is actually about a word, so to say, or a root, perhaps, messy. And messy is prominently a verb. It can be translated as to give birth, to fashion, to create. And the reason I'm relating messy to all these three questions is that, well, first, it's obviously a way to create. So basically the creator gives birth, namely to gods, deities, and human beings. And so human beings and gods are said to be created via a messy action. So it also relates to the second question, what is created? But the thing is that messy is being interpreted also as a proof, or an unequivocal proof sometimes, according to some authors, of the so-called androgyny of the creator god in ancient Egypt, particular in this corpus. So in a way, messy also affects the first question, who creates the identity of the creator? Now, the interesting thing about messy is that often, or maybe not so often, as you shall see, at least in the corpus I'm dealing with, my PhD thesis, has classifiers or determinatives, if you prefer. So for those of you who are not Egyptologists, basically these are signs that are added to the end of the word to sort of clarify its meaning or to say what it is about. For instance, if I write my name, Guilherme, I would add a male sign in the end to clarify that Guilherme is a male name, okay? But classifiers are optional. So they're not always present in writing a word. And in fact, if you see, this is basically a print screen from an online dictionary resource for Egyptian, and messy, the word there is not written with a classifier, but sometimes they're present. So the idea of this paper and thus talk is to actually consider why messy is being envisaged as a tool among others, or as a factor, if you will, among others, to consider the demiurge, the creator, as an androgynous entity. And so messy, along the fact that the creator is called father and mother in sources, and also the demiurgic masturbatory act, have been, among others, as I was saying, main reasons to consider the creator as an androgynous entity. In the paper and in the talk, I will mostly focus on the third one here, so messy, of course, but I will briefly mention the others as well. So the idea was to challenge, or at least question, this immediate androgyny, if you will, in the specific corpus. And the first thing that it's important to say is that Messi itself is more than biology. So it's not always biology. It can also be related to a manual artisanal act, for instance. It's even mentioned in sources in reference to the creation of statues, for instance. And I've centered my paper around two main axes. First, the writings of the word. So the presence or absence of classifiers or determinatives, if you prefer. And then the phraseological context, meaning we should look at Messi within each textual excerpt in this corpus and other corpora, of course, to see if the translation to give birth makes sense, and thus if we're actually saying that a male entity is giving birth. So we shall start by considering some sources where Messi is actually to give birth, or its most direct translation. I must say that I consider more texts in the paper than the ones I will be talking to you tonight. If you're a Portuguese-speaking person, I strongly recommend you to read the paper if you have an interest in this topic. If you're not a Portuguese-speaking person, I'll be happy to discuss it with you afterwards, provided that I speak the language, of course. So the mention of Messi as a cosmogonical verb, if you will, as a way to create the world, goes back in time, but in the religious hymns of the New Kingdom, we have it from the very beginning of it, if you will. So immediately in the first half of the 18th dynasty, we already have mentions to the word Messi, particularly in relation to the self-genesis, meaning the creator would create himself via a Messi action. And in this particular excerpt, the creator is said to give birth to himself every hour. And some sources also mention every day, for instance. And this is related to the solar cycle in ancient Egyptian cosmological system. So to be very brief about it, the sun will carry out a daily and a night journey. So obviously the daily will be when it will be visible, and a mythological way to explain it would be to say that the mother of the sun would swallow the sun every evening, then to expel it through her vagina, so thus giving birth at every morning. This is depicted in the iconography, for instance, in the tomb ceiling of Ramses VI in the Valley of the Kings. So basically here we have a mention to Messi in relation to the self-creation, but in a process of what Assmann has called creatio continua, meaning that the sun continually recreates himself and thus the entire cosmos, and thus the world continues to exist in a cyclical way, to say it very briefly. What is also interesting is that whereas in the first instance, so here, we actually have no classifier for the word Messi. Hopefully you can see it there. Here in the Berlin Stele, which is from the 18th dynasty as well, but roughly later, so after Marne, the word Messi is written with the sign that I showed you before on the first slides. So here the sign is being used not as a classifier, that is not to specify a word, but rather as a phonogram, so to say. So the sign is the sound and the sound is the meaning, if you will. So who gives birth to himself daily, but specifically with the sign of the women giving birth, or the women in labor. And this continues throughout the New Kingdom. Here we have a stele from Copenhagen, and sorry that as I was saying, I'm only considering very, very briefly. I discussed this more in more detail throughout the paper, but obviously due to time reasons, I'm doing very concisely here. And so in this stele from Copenhagen, as I was saying, the creator is said to give birth to himself, but also to create his own mother and his own hand. Whereas the creation of his mother actually deals to a fact of primordiality and ontological anteriority. There is to say the creator is so older, if you will, so primordial than all the other beings that he is accounted and responsible, if you will, for the creation of his own mother. So to emphasize his ontological anteriority. But he's also said to create his hand. And it's interesting to see that from the pyramid text, so way before the New Kingdom religious hymns, the creator is said to create the primordial gods, the couple of twins Shu and Tefnut, in many biological metaphors, as they were called by Caron in her master thesis. And one of those biological metaphors is actually via a masturbation process. So the creator who would achieve orgasms via a masturbation and thus create the twins, the primordial gods Shu and Tefnut. So here we have possibly, and I emphasize this, possibly, the mention to the creation of the hand might be a mention to that demiurgic masturbatory act, but it might also not be. It might also be a mention to the fact, or to a creation of through an artisanal process, as we shall see very briefly. But just bear this in mind, that back from the pyramid text, we have biological accounts of the creation, namely of the primordial gods, with the intervention of the hand. So basically, in the Copenhagen excerpt, the demiurge, the creator, would be creating the devices, the tools, if you will, to then achieve his creation on the second level, on the second stage. This idea of the masturbation or of the mating goes throughout the New Kingdom as well. Here we have a later text from the reign of Ramesses II. This is a very famous text for many different reasons that I don't have time to explain here. It's called Leiden 1-350. It's studied from Ramesses II reign. It's written in Arabic, and I'll mention why this is important in a while as well. And here we also have a mention to the fact that the creator interacts with his hand or his fist as a husband. Please bear this in mind, as a husband, when there was no vulva or uterus. So if I start briefly addressing the issue of androgyny now, the creator here is clearly rendered as a husband when there was no vulva uterus. So if androgyny might be or not, as we shall see, a conflation of both female and male attributes from the most cis heteronormative perspective, if you will, or not, then it looks to me that the creator here is clearly not androgynous. But what has been perhaps triggering many research to consider it like that was that the creator is said to give birth to what exists, and after, father is labeled father of the fathers and mother of the mothers. This issue, as I mentioned before, is one of the factors as well that it's been leading research to consider the creator as androgynous. I think there's a lot of discussion to go there. I'm currently hopefully preparing a paper on that, and it will be one of the chapters of my thesis. I don't think that father of the fathers and mother of the mothers is necessarily androgynous. It might be related more to primordiality, ontological anteriority, but also to the fact that the creator is a all-encompassing entity that cares for this creation the entire time. So, and we know from anthropological studies, for instance, that someone, for instance, who has been brought up in a monoparental family would refer to his caretaker as my mother and my father, not necessarily implying that that person is androgynous or is not identified in the binary sex gender spectrum. But I want to develop that here, but just so to give you a clue, that Messi also occurs with this binomial father and mother in the same entity. And then what also has led many commentaries about the supposed androgyny of the creator, and is also attesting this corpus, is the fact that not only is the creator said to give birth, he is also said to be a begetter. So, for instance, here in this stela, we have the expression who begets and gives birth to himself. So thus, the creator would be a father that begets and a mother who gives birth. Interestingly, in this joint attestations of the verb utech and the root messi, we have a very inconsistent pattern of classifier distribution. So here I'm considering the 4 attestations I found so far in my, so to say, my corpus, so meaning the religious inns of the New Kingdom, of this particular expression, utech su Messi Joseph, so who begets himself and gives birth by himself. And as you can see, whereas utech, so if you will, the male component, it's invariably marked with a male classifier, D53, meaning the penis with the semen. The second verb, Messi, it might be graphed with the sign B3, so the woman in labor, the woman giving birth, B2, so it's a sign also related to a female, but it might just not have any sign at all. And it's very speculative what I'm saying, but I just consider the hypothesis, and I stress this, just a thought, it's not taken for granted or even as a categorical reasoning, that the fact that you would write Messi without a classifier would actually to undermine and not to, sort of to reduce any level of gender ambiguity that it might have based on the fact that you have the verbs utech and Messi all together. Now you might ask me, maybe that's actually an issue of the support, the materiality of the document, or even the script. But then again, not necessarily. These 4 sources are all written in hieroglyphic. 2 of them are written in papyri and the other in stela, so in stone, so in the monumental register, if you prefer. And as you can see, the distribution of the classifiers is not consistent, even regarding the material. So you have, for instance, BMEA 552 doesn't have a classifier, whereas 551 has. So it's definitely not related to materiality as it is. And then if I consider other attestations of Messi and utech other than the expression I was saying before, and then again looking at the script, we find also some interesting things. So for instance, in the sources written in hieratic, again, for those of you who are not Egyptologists, and to say it very, very briefly, hieratic is a cursive Egyptian script. And you often found this sign here that you have on top. It's a Z5, and it's sort of a simplification, if you will, of more elaborate signs in hieratic script. And Messi might be written with that. Messi and also other derived words, such as semesi, which is a causative, might be written with Z5. And we might wonder whether this Z5 is replacing in hieratic what in hieroglyph would be D52, B3, B2, or B4. So I just wanted to leave all that there. But obviously, as I was saying in the beginning, classifiers are optional. And obviously, to sustain a whole argument based on classifiers, something that it's actually optional to write or not, might be very fragile. So I've done it because I think it's important to look at it, as it's one of the reasons, and it might be its presence or its absence might be deliberate or not. It's very difficult to assert that, of course. But if we look at now at particular phraseological contexts where Messi might actually not be biological, the argument of a non-androgyny of the creator might be emphasized, if you agree with me, of course. So here we have BMEA 826. This is the famous stele of Suti and Hor. Then again, I would love to go in more detail here, but I can't, as time doesn't allow us. But what is interesting in these 2 excerpts is that they both have the verb or the root Messi. In the first case, it's actually a passive. And translators, the various editors of this text, so to say, have been struggling with its translation. So some of them prefer to translate it as in a biological sense, for instance, procreator without being born in the first excerpt, and others prefer a more artisanal craftsman way as modeler without being modeled. And as we've seen before, Messi covers all this semantic spectrum, so it's a very polysemical root. If we look at the first excerpt, in the first words, ptar tu, this also led to many different translations. So Assmann, for instance, translates as "you are ptah." Other authors prefer to translate it as "sculpture of yourself," as I've done here. But it's interesting that this verb, or this word, this root ptah, actually relates to a manual activity, so to a sculpturing activity, to form, to create. And then we have the verb nebi immediately after, which is also related to a sculptural, fashionable, manual activity, so to fashion, to model, to gild. And then we have ut mestuef, which relates obviously to the word messi with all the polysemy I've been talking about. So we can think of this excerpt in a twofold way, I believe. So messi might be translated in the manual / artisanal way to, if you will, make a sort of coherence and sequential scheme with the two previous verbs, which are also related to manual activities, or it can actually be translated in a biological way to emphasize sort of the overability of the creator God and the various ways that he creates and is brought into existence. So to say, I must also stress that this text is difficult to translate also because it has no classifiers or almost no classifiers, because as I've said before, they're optional. So translators have been hesitating between considering it a biological or an artisanal way, and the same in the second excerpt, actually. So we have the same expression, without being born or without being modeled. If we move now to this stele, also from the Copenhagen Glyptotek collection, this is even more important, because here we have an in address to Ptah, and Ptah is a deity, one of the creator deities in ancient Egypt that was actually related to artisans and craftspeople. And here we also have the verb messi, and now it's followed, or actually it follows, that's what I meant, the verb ccalled, which again is an artisanal related word. So it can be translated, for instance, as to form, to fashion, to build. And here again, we're talking about the theogonical moment, meaning the god is said to create, the creator is said to create the gods, and it might be that he's giving birth to them, or it might be that he's actually modeling them. Once again, we can think about this in two ways. So if you consider it's actually being modeled, it would make sense with ccalled. So we would have two verbs, two words relating to manual artisanal labor activities. If you consider it in a biological way, it would also be meaningful to emphasize the different ways, different processes, the different mechanisms that the creator might mobilize to achieve creation and to create the various entities of the world. So here we would have who built the human being. So you have anthropogony, the creation of humankind via an artisanal manual way, and theogony, the creation of the gods via a biological way, or we have two artisanal labor ways. But I think it's important to consider different translations and to think about this, because if we see and if we agree that messi is an artisanal activity, then again, there's no reason to consider, for instance, in this instance, the creator as an androgynous being just because he's performing a messi action. And this again goes further in time. So here we have another Ramesses text, another erratic papyrus, also from Leiden, and here the god is addressed, so praises to you, the one who give birth or model everything that exists. And then he is once again called father and mother of the gods and goddesses. And then again, I won't develop this much further, but then we have a mention to the love of him. And then we have referencing to anthropogony and the creation of animals as well, but also the organization of space and the geographic territory by creating cities and founding districts, for instance. So here, once again, as we have no classified and not even the Z5, so the erratic simplification I talked before, we might cogitate, we might think about different translations for this excerpt. And the way we do that actually inflects the way we understand the creator as a whole. So is messi or related to androgyny of the creator deity or not? Is it even possible to address this question in this very straightforward way? Coming back to the verbs messy and attach, authors have consistently claimed that messy is related to female entities and attached to male ones. And here we have an example from the tomb of Pazar the Vizier. So here we have what I've included in bold, who gave birth to his mother and begot his father. So yeah, to give birth to a female entity and begetting a masculine one. But then again, if I come back to the previous text I was considering from Leiden, we have the reverse of this situation. So the one who gave birth to Gab and begot Nut. So things might be more complicated than that. And if, again, I look at the classifiers of Messi, and I must stress that I'm considering for my thesis the phraseology related to the creator and the creation in the religious hymns of the New Kingdom, and I found 72 attestations of Messi so far in relation to these contexts. And out of these 72, more than 60% do not have a classifier. And again, I emphasize that it's very fragile to assert something exclusively based on classifiers, but I think it's meaningful either way, this absence, and so I would like to note it here. But I think it will be wiser, as I'm trying to do, to look at each excerpt, each textual passage, to figure out in which context, in which phraseological context Messi is actually being depicted and written. And so we have A17 as a child, and this is mostly for the word mesu, which might be translated as children. Then B2, which is a female sign, as I told you before, and then B3, so the woman giving birth, and the Z5 being sort of this simplification, if you will, in Arabic script of more elaborate signs, possibly, or most probably even, I would say, B2 or B3. As I've said before, B3 might also be used as a phonogram, so to say the word Messi as well, to make the sound and the meaning, if you will. If we consider attach, on the other hand, the scenario is completely different. Now, I know that the attestations of this verb in my corpus are way fewer than Messi, but it is interesting to note that 75% of them include D53, so the penis with the semen, and 17%, which is actually only 2 of them, are written with D52. So it's a very unbalanced distribution, but we can see that it's not coherent, it's not systematic. But it's interesting to see that Utach is consistently written with the male, graphically male, if you will, sign, whereas Messi, including in attestations where Utach and Messi are jointly written, is sometimes omitted. And once again, I wonder if the omission of a female sign in a sentence with Utach and Messi is deliberate or not. If it is deliberate, it might be actually to say, look, this god is actually male. So jumping into my conclusions, I must say that the creator is the author of sex and gender differentiation, and this can be attested from the pyramid texts, so many centuries before the religious hymns of the New Kingdom were written, including the passage that I mentioned before, but also others. This biological creation of the creator god continues throughout time, namely in the coffin text, but also in Papyrus Brahmin ruins, which was written in Ptolemaic times. So you can see how this mythem of this motive actually traverses various chronologies of ancient Egyptian textual and religious sources. And this idea of the copulation, the fact that the god copulated with his fist or his hand, has led many authors to consider that the deity, the creator deity, has androgynous, and we have authors that claim that the hand acts as a female consort, or the mouth, because in some accounts, again, I don't have time to talk about this, but in some accounts, the semen of the god would fall into his mouth, and then he would spit the primordial gods. And this will be, according to some authors, a magical replacement of the female organs. But I want to emphasize that there's nothing female about a hand interacting with a phallus and achieving an orgasm necessarily. From a cis-normative perspective, at least, there's nothing female about the interaction of the hand and the phallus interacting and achieving an orgasm. Nor the mouth is entirely, or exclusively, better saying, perhaps, a female organ. So perhaps what led the authors to consider is that the actual word for hand in ancient Egyptian, well, one of them, was jeret, and this has the termination t, and t was the termination for female nouns, according to the Egyptian language system or grammar. But many sources, including the ones I've showed before, actually mention the word, not the word jeret, so not the word hand, but the word hefa, the word fist, and fist is actually a male noun. It's actually a masculine substantive, masculine noun. So it doesn't even get along with the argument. And again, I cannot say this for sure, but perhaps was the termination T in the word jeret that led so many people to consider the hand as a consort of the god, at least in the chronology I'm referring to, of course. And so this, and also the Messi and Utech conjunction or concomitant attestations in their sources was called by Zandi, for instance, as characteristic of an androgynous god. He can give birth as a mother and engender as a father. But I think we should bear in mind that we're here talking about biological metaphors, and that the uterine and phallic functions, when referring to the god, are more a symbolic expression of an abstract exposition, as it was stated and argued by Troy, for instance. So Messi in the religious hymns of the New Kingdom is not always related to a biological act, as I've briefly, hopefully showed. The classifiers do not give us a frequent distribution, and its absence of a clear-cut female one might be enlightening or not. I totally accept if you don't think it's enlightening at all. But the fact is that that is a strong opposition with Utech, where the phallus is omnipresent, so to say. And then if we look at the phraseological context, there's a very meaningful relation to a manual artisanal work, especially when verbs such as ked or nebi are mentioned in the exact same textual excerpt. So is the creator androgynous, and is Messi enlightening something about us? Well, I just Googled a very simple definition of androgynous in English in Cambridge Online Dictionary. So androgynous, according to this dictionary, is not clear male or female, or having both male and female features. As far as I'm aware, the creator in this corpus, but also in other corpora from this time and before, is never rendered, or the male creator, better think, is never rendered from a grammatical point of view as a female entity. The iconography is quite binary, so to say, as well. And so I don't necessarily see the female and male attributions. So perhaps, and we also have to think that contrary to the combinations of, for instance, animal and human dimensions, the blurring of the boundaries between sex and gender in the Egyptian divine world is much, much rarer. And male deities and the creator god is predominantly male in the New Kingdom. And even later, I won't get that. Oh, sorry, but yeah, even later, it's almost exclusively male, apart from a few exceptions, perhaps. So even authors that actually claim for an androgyny of the creator god come to recognize the tension of the identification, because the deity ultimately is identified in the binary spectrum, is either female or male. And another thing, and this comes back to what Stephanie was telling us before, that fertility and procreation related symbology is not always associated with the female dimension. And here I would recommend the article by Roth, in which she clearly shows us that fertility is mostly a male feature in ancient Egypt. So the combination of Messi and Utech, so this capability of the creator to engender and give birth, yes, it relates to ontological totality, to primordiality, to self-sufficiency. The creator himself, with his own body, with his own biology, with his own manual artisanal activity, is able to achieve the world, to achieve creation, to get the words into being, to invoke the different entities of the cosmos into existence, from this transmutation from unity to plurality. But the association of the creator to procreation, does not necessarily undermine or compromise masculinity. Is in this corpus, at least in this particular excerpts that I've shown you, is always given a male name, never is used a female pronoun to address his being or his persona. And so it's not because the creator is actually set even to give birth that we have to see him as androgynous. So it might be actually an association of this symbolic universe of fertility and procreation to the male divine sphere. I'm obviously not claiming that the Egyptian thought that actually human males would give birth, but to the male divine sphere, and not necessarily to compromise or undermine his masculinity. So androgyny might be an operative concept. It might be an interesting tool to start with, but I think we should not automatically assume it. We should not uncritically assume. So I would claim and argue that we should look at each individual text when possible and figure out if Messi is actually pointing to an androgynous instance in that text or not. So it's basically about going deeper and trying to go further with the texts. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Guilherme, for your fantastic and also provocative presentation. I will now start with the questions. So I will invite everyone back on screen if Gabriel can help us. So here we are. Yeah. So if you have questions for our speakers, please write them down in the chat so I can pass to them. So we have already some questions. So we have actually one for each. So I'm going to read and then I'll give you some time to answer, and we will probably have another run of a question. So just bear with me for a second so I can organize everything. Okay, so I will start one to Stephanie by Anne Austin. She asks, what biological definition of sex is the universal binary one that you believe all people should recognize? I will read the next one for Anita. Anita, congratulations. I want to know if you have put together a classification of the available documentation based on the gender categories that you have discussed. Thanks. And the next one, the next two questions, I will pile them to Guilherme. The first one, does the androgyny, of the Egyptian creative deity confuse the reality of the Egyptian imaginary with this theological and religious speculation? In what respects? I'm not sure if it's clear. I can come back to that. The second question, the person says, I love the paper. Cheryl Morgan. Hi, Cheryl. I love the paper, Guilherme. Presumably gods such as Amun-Ra and Ptah are gendered male in ancient Egyptian. Is the Aten also gender? And if so, how? Is that okay? Yeah. Shall we? So Stephanie, do you want to start?
Okay, so if I remember the question correctly, it is what are the means by which we establish biologically binary sex? This can be approached in two complementary ways. Bear in mind, I go through this a lot more in the paper, so please read the paper because there's way more detail there. But quickly here, you can approach the question both from in terms of the genetics and from the phenotype. So there's genotype and there is phenotype. Genotype is a matter of basically what your genes are written in your cells. So X chromosomes, Y chromosomes. The phenotype is how an individual appears outside in the body. So these normally agree with each other about 99.98% of the time. So generally speaking, XX chromosomes is going to get you a female phenotype. XY chromosomes are going to get you an XY phenotype. And this is pretty universal, and like I said, it is pretty constant. The statistics are over 99%. The ancients did not have access to genotype, so when they read sex and gender, it was purely by way of phenotype. So if you had a penis, you were probably a guy, and you probably continue to look like a guy as you grow up. And if you had a vagina, female, same thing, you're going to continue looking female, and you'll be treated as female in your society the same way the person born with the penis was treated as male. Things get a tad more complicated in modern times because there are those very rare places where the genotype and the phenotype don't match up. This most not commonly, but it has its greatest contrast between the two with what is known as congenital, excuse me, sir, a bit late here too, androgen, okay, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. I have no idea how that's going to be translated into Portuguese. And this is basically where an individual has a Y chromosome, XY chromosome, but the body is resistant to testosterone and thus does not develop as male in utero. As a result, the individual, even though being XY genotype, develops a female phenotype. And it's a very rare scenario. However, phenotype, once again, female. These individuals look female. They are treated as female. They self-identify as female in all the studies done of them, and usually are not discovered to be anything other than XX when they go, potentially they are trying to figure out, well, why are they not menstruating, or why are they infertile, and all of a sudden you get a surprise in your genes. So the XXXY genotype to phenotype is that universal binary, the code for the role that individuals are going to play in reproduction. And it is only in modern times that we start having those extremely rare categories where the phenotype and the genotype do not match up. But even in most of those instances where there is some oddness in the genotype, the phenotype continues to be constant. So for example, those individuals with Turner syndrome who have X0, so no second X or a Y, still female phenotype. And like I said, those individuals with the complete androgen insensitivity syndrome present as female phenotype as well. So genes plus phenotype will give you that biologically consistent binary sexuality predicated on reproduction, which is why sex exists in the first place, with some extremely rare contradictions between the two that still frequently give you a constant phenotype, and then a very tiny fraction of the population that are straight out hermaphroditic, where the phenotype itself is edgy, different between the two, if you will, but that is such a small percentage that, and it also happens to cluster in individual populations. One of them happens to be Brazil, by the way. Another one is in Southern Africa. That, especially when considering ancient studies and their constructs of binary sex and gender, probably would have had almost no role to play. So that's the answer to the question. And like I said, there is way more detail in the paper, so please look there.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Anita, can you do it now? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Rodrigo, for the question. I'm really happy to see you here. Actually, I have selected my documentation based on three criteria. And the first one is the availability of the access of this documentation. The second one is I selected women from the first generation of families merchants that leave Mesopotamia to Anatolia. And the third one, they are families that I can follow more than one generation of women. So now I organize my documentation according to family-based system. I deal with three families fond d'archives, I don't know how to say in English. And but about gender, yes, my thesis is one of my goals in my thesis is to compare the letters of men and the letters of women of these families to understand a little bit about the gender regimes, how they function. So thank you.
Okay, now I will ask Guilherme to answer. Guilherme, is that okay? The questions, did you get? I put in the private chat again, so you can have a look.
I'm not entirely sure I got the first one.
Yeah.
To be honest.
The first person.
A quick remark. Hopefully it will.
Yeah, Denilson, would you mind, please, to write down your question in Portuguese? Might be easier for us to get. Maybe it's word rephrasing something.
But I would, if you allow me just a minute. Actually, I would argue that oftentimes, perhaps with the most evident exception would be Nate, the goddess Nate, in the temple of Esna. I would argue that most androgynous speculation about the creator is much more about Egyptological elaboration than the actual Egyptian sources. So that's just the quick remark that I would do regarding the first question, and hopefully if Denilson can rephrase it, maybe there is something else that I couldn't say. And regarding the second one from Shirley, thank you for your comment on my paper. So Aten is actually quite tricky one, if I must say. I know that in her book, Troy, if I'm not mistaken, she actually says that it also encompasses the female and the male aspects in this dimension of totality. So the sun disk would be related to the uterus symbology, whereas the rays that come from the sun disk could be envisaged as a phallic symbol. So that would relate to the complementarity in the figure. But then coming to my point, complementarity doesn't necessarily have to be androgyny in a way. And also, I must say that in the Great Hymn to Aten, there is a mention of the god creating the embryo or the seed in the uterus. So he's a god, and he's allowing and enable human reproduction as it is, biologically speaking, to exist, to come forward. So if he superintends over the human reproduction as well, but is, well, the word is a male one, there's no T termination. So yeah, and then there's the iconographical aspect that I've mentioned before. Yeah, so but obviously Aten was meant to be visible. So I mean, it's the sun disk itself, and that will be the total creator, so to say. Yeah, and also there's also this perspective that the creation of the sun, particularly when we're talking about Aten, is a perpetually reenacted one. So in this creatio continua, and not necessarily as the Egyptians call it, the first time septipi, so the actual moment when Genesis, so to say, happened. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but if I didn't, feel free to address it back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I can't see more questions from the audience, so maybe we can give ourselves a bit of space to question each other's papers or each other's presentations. So if any of you have any question or comment as well, feel free to do.
I do, actually, if I may.
Yes.
To Stephanie, thank you very much for both your paper and your presentation. I was also in that conference in Athens back in 2016, actually. So we met there. And it was really interesting to me while reading your paper that from a different, completely different context, you also have mentions of father and mother, or woman and man, or brother and sister, but in that case, relating to a female human figure or person. So I was wondering if you could elaborate some on that, because you also argue, and I find it very interesting, that there's nothing to do with gender bending or any confusion on the gender, but also it is more related to gender hierarchies and gender roles, so to say. But yeah, because yeah, it's a different context of what I found for religious texts, which labeled the creator god as father and mother, but I also don't think that that's related to androgyny. So if you could talk about that, we would love it. Thank you.
Okay, are you referring to the section I'm not certain I follow. On the Devadasi, where the Devadasi, who are female, are nevertheless referred to as...
No, actually, maybe I was referring to the Mesopotamian texts, the Testament.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, those are the first case of the gender bending, and I've been fascinated with those cases for a very long time. What you basically have is a society that is predicated on the notion that you are going to have a son who will inherit from you. So he's going to get the house, he's going to get the land, stuff like that. He's also going to maintain the ancestral cult. So he's going to pray for you and give offerings to you. And then you frequently wind up with households where you do not have one. So this seems to be a primary scenario where you're in a terrible bind. You don't have the son that you need to get into the afterlife and to inherit your property. So there were a number of what Josué Justel calls a legal fiction, whereby you literally, legally make females in your household male. And there are a number of technical terms for this in the Mesopotamian. One of them is the anamartuti epeshu, literally to make into sonship, to turn someone into a son. And that is one of the terms that we find, especially in last wills and testaments, where a dying father, and it's always a male, will say that he turns his daughter or daughters, anamartuti epeshu, into sonship, and they become legal males. So female sex, but a social male gender. And this gives them the rights and the prerogatives and the privileges of, or at least many of them, of being male. So they can inherit the house, so that they can perform the ancestor cult and that kind of domestic priesthood, if you want to think about it that way. You also have cases where dying father will turn either his own wife or one of his children into the mother and father of the household. Once again, this gives the woman in question the rights of a man, so that she can inherit the house, so that she can take on the family cult, and she can take part in a number of the other economic issues that are involved in the running of a household. So again, it is a legal fiction that functionally turns females into male gender. However, there's a catch, and one of the points of my paper is that there is always a catch. If these women were actual males, they would have the prerogative to remarry if they want to, which these women absolutely cannot do. These fathers who are making their daughters into sons or into fathers are nevertheless saying, okay, so-and-so is going to get married. So the father is still determining who his daughters are going to marry, and they will marry. They don't have the option to get out of it. They don't necessarily have the option to find alternate paths. There are still stipulations in the wills for, okay, the property goes to so-and-so, and then if and when she dies, it goes to so-and-so else. And she can't remarry, and she can't divide up the property the way she wants to. So this creation of the anamartuti epeshu and this creation of father and motherhood simultaneously temporarily gives women certain restricted rights that are normally reserved for males, but does not give them the full benefits of masculinity, if you will. It is never forgotten that they are female, and their male rights are always constricted. Does that answer your question?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thais, can I do a little comment about the question of Guilherme, and also a question to Stephanie? I was thinking about the old Assyrian documentation that you use in your article. It's not a documentation that I do in my thesis, but I know a little bit about it. And I was thinking if it's not a question about gender at all, or at least not only gender, but it's a question about kinship, maybe. Because maybe look at this documentation about the performance of woman, and not in the terms of Judith Butler performance, but inside the kinship, you know, it's more interesting. I don't know if it's clear.
I'm not certain if I understand. What do you mean in terms of kinship?
to understand if those women are performing different roles inside the kingship organization, pardon, not in gender roles.
Okay, actually, a really fascinating topic there. From everything I have been able to find, girls who are turned into boys, women who are turned into fathers, continue to act the exact same way. That woman who is now mother and father of the household, who's not allowed to remarry, and if she does, she has to leave the household. She's still being treated as a woman. She's still acting as a woman. I'm really sorry. You can probably hear the sirens outside. I live across the street
No
from
problem.
the fire station. And the daughters who are being told that they are being made into sons, and of course we're having your marriage arranged for you, and we're telling you whom you're going to marry, and oh, by the way, if you don't have children for him, he can take another wife, etc., etc. So they have amazingly little agency in spite of the fact that they've been turned into males. Now, contrast this with another technical term that you might have come across in Mesopotamian studies, and this is what is known as the harimtu, on whom I've done an awful lot of work. Now, harimtu is normally translated as prostitute. A harimtu is not a prostitute. A harimtu is a female, a girl or a woman, who has no father and no husband. So she is basically outside of the standard patriarchal family unit. She has no patriarchal authority over her. These are the females who are more likely to act as males in Mesopotamian society. And I gave as one example, one of my favorite examples actually, in my paper is this girl named, I'm not kidding, Dada. And in his last will and testament, her father makes Dada the harimtu, mother and father of the family. And she is the one to whom her younger sisters, who are not harimatu, because they're going to get married for whatever reason Dada is not. She inherits all the property. She inherits authority over the family. She is obviously not given away in marriage because she is a harimtu for whatever reason, but her younger sisters owe her respect, and she can kick them out of the house if they do not give her respect. She is basically overseeing her older sister's marriage, which has already been arranged, and she apparently has control over the marriage of her younger sister, which she has to arrange as well. The harimatu are way more likely to, say, be tavern keepers or to own property, and to have that role as, have more masculine privileges in society than the girls who are given masculinity in dad's last will and testament, and sometimes even in the adoption clauses. I have one in there. So if you compare and contrast the fictional sons and fathers in the wills and testament with the harimatu, you'll notice that there's a greater gender bending with the harimatu than there are with the sons and fathers, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
We have one question from the audience. Sherry Morgan is asking Stephanie. Stephanie, I love the survey. Oh, can you actually read, Stephanie, or shall I read for you?
I can actually see there, and I know Cheryl, so we've met.
Fantastic! Yeah.
Place, actually. No, I haven't. To what does it refer? What part of human society?
Well, she might write something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we are running a bit of time now. So we have another special announcement for this evening. I just would like to thank the speakers, our special guests, Stephanie Budin, Anita Fattori, and Guilherme. Guilherme, especially you for being with us until so late. We really appreciate. Hope you sleep well after today. And so thank you, everyone. We are very pleased to have this opportunity. I'm sure this event reached a lot of people all over the world, as we could see in the chat. We really appreciate everyone in the audience for staying with us, no matter where you are. We know it could be very early or very late, so we thank you all. And I will now finish my part in English because we are bringing Ana Paula Scarpa, PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo, who is going to introduce the new volume, which is out today, of Mare Nostrum. And she's going to make the announcement in Portuguese. Most of the papers, actually all the papers in this issue are written in Portuguese. So in respect to that, we invite Ana Paula to talk a bit more about this volume. And we say goodbye here. Thank you again, everyone. Hope you enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bom, boa noite a todas e todos que nos assistem nesse momento e que também nos assistirão num futuro aí, né, próximo ou distante, não sabemos. Meu nome é Ana Paula Scarpa, como a Thaís disse, eu sou doutoranda do programa de pós-graduação em História Social aqui da USP e membro do Laboratório de Estudos sobre o Império Romano e Mediterrâneo Antigo da USP. No entanto, é importante dizer, né, que eu falo aqui hoje não apenas por mim mesma, mas falo também em nome do meu colega, o Pedro Pisa, também doutorando do PPGHS USP, também membro do LEIR-MA USP, e com quem eu tive a alegria de compartilhar a organização do volume 11, número 2, 2020, da revista Mare Nostrum. Por uma questão de limites de pessoas dentro da sala virtual, infelizmente o Pedro não pôde estar conosco hoje, mas ele gentilmente me cedeu esse espaço para que, com muita alegria, eu realizasse em nome de nós dois o lançamento oficial do próximo volume da revista Mare Nostrum, ou no caso agora já o volume atual da revista Mare Nostrum, o qual já pode ser acessado no site da revista, e o Gabriel já forneceu aqui para a gente o link. Muito obrigada, Gabriel. Esse volume, né, que temos a satisfação de lançar hoje, ele traz como temática a questão das religiões, religiosidades e cultura material no mundo antigo, no qual propusemos, né, o Pedro e eu, a possibilidade, o debate e a possibilidade de exploração das inúmeras variáveis da materialidade da religião na antiguidade, suas imagens, seus objetos devocionais, os seus espaços sagrados, a sua arte, os seus artefatos, a sua arquitetura e, da mesma forma, suas indumentárias, os seus ídolos, iconografias, santuários, paisagens, né, enfim, dentre muitos outros. Os exemplos são muitos, como muitas são também as possibilidades abertas aos estudiosos das religiões e religiosidades na antiguidade. No Brasil, a feliz comprovação disso encontra-se no fato de o presente volume ser composto por contribuições variadas, né, e advindas das mais diversas universidades do país. Mediante a resposta tão positiva do cenário nacional de pesquisas, né, é com grande alegria que nós comunicamos também que o dossiê que se apresenta hoje é o primeiro de 2 volumes da revista Mare Nostrum que contarão com a temática da religião, religiosidade e cultura material no mundo antigo. Dessa forma, né, o volume que nós apresentamos a vocês hoje é composto de 8 artigos que formam um dossiê, um artigo de tema livre, uma tradução inédita de fonte que inaugura a seção Documentos da revista Mare Nostrum e, por fim, 2 resenhas críticas de obras nacionais e internacionais que foram recentemente publicadas. Assim sendo, né, nós convidamos a todas e todos que nos assistem a acessarem e a divulgarem o novo volume da revista Mare Nostrum, bem como a acompanharem nosso site e nossas páginas nas redes sociais, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter, por meio das quais em breve nós lançaremos mais informações também sobre a próxima edição do Colóquio Mare Nostrum, a qual trará igualmente os autores e autoras dos artigos que compõem o dossiê e que apresentamos hoje a vocês com tanta satisfação. Por fim, nós desejamos a todas e todos uma boa leitura e fazemos votos de que esse volume colabore com a reflexão nacional acadêmica sobre a faceta da materialidade das religiões e religiosidades no mundo antigo. Assim, com tão boa notícia e com o lançamento de muitos planos futuros, né, nós fechamos essas semanas tão frutíferas de discussões tão bem postas pelo volume que foi lançado primeiramente no ano e por esse colóquio tão bem organizado pela Thaís, pelo Fabrício, pela Sara, a quem nós agradecemos também, né, e em nome de todos, da revista Mare Nostrum e do LEIR-MA USP, eu desejo a todos uma boa noite e peço que nos aguardem, porque nos veremos em breve. Até mais a todos.